Welcome to another Thursday night Bible study, brought to you as a ministry of SIGBC.
We've been talking about the subject of contentment. Contentment we think of often as that which we attain when our needs are met, when we have all that we want, when we have all that we need, when we have all that we desire. And so contentment we think of usually as something that is to be attained as a result of getting what we want. And Paul, both to Timothy as well as to the Philippians, gave us really a completely different perspective from what we usually think of as the basis for contentment. It is true that it's easier to be content when we have all that we want, all that we need, all that we desire. It's true that it is easier to be content when things are going our way, when we see more success than failure, when we have health rather than sickness, when we have lots of friends rather than only a few. And so it's the natural conclusion from our experiences is that contentment comes from good circumstances. But to Timothy, Paul writes and says, look, really contentment is not about getting all these riches, getting all these good things. Contentment is only possible with godliness. And no matter how much we gain, materially speaking, no matter how much we gain, without godliness, there is no such thing as true contentment. And so he says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6 through 8, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. I remember the story, it's just a joke, not a true story, but I remember the story about a guy who had worked all his whole life and he had attained lots and lots of wealth, and he was old and he was about to die. And so he called his wife into the room and he said, listen, I know that I'm about to die. I don't want to leave all the stuff that I have behind. So he says, here's what I want you to do. He says, I want you to go to the bank, get as much money as you can out and put it in suitcases. Fill those suitcases up. And I want you to take 2 suitcases filled with money, and I want you to put it in the attic right above my bed. And he says, when I die, as my spirit is going up into heaven, he says, I'll grab those 2 suitcases and take it with me. And so his wife, of course, to honor his wishes, when he passed away, she went to the bank. When he was about to pass away, she went to the bank and she drew the money out, put it in suitcases, put it right above his bed. The days went by until finally he did pass away. They had the funeral and everything was back to normal again, and she decided to start cleaning up. And so as she cleaned up the house, she got everything organized, and they had stored some things up in the attic, of course, and so she went upstairs to organize the attic. And as she began organizing the attic, she looked over, she saw the 2 suitcases that her husband was supposed to have grabbed on his way up to heaven. She saw those 2 suitcases sitting there still right above, in the attic above his bed. And she said, I knew I should have put them in the basement. You'll get that eventually. All right. The reality is contentment is not about what we get in this life. Contentment is about trusting that what we have is from God. And so to the Philippians, Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13, I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. And I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. So Paul writes to the Philippians, and he concludes with a very quite often misinterpreted passage in the Bible. I can do all this, or I can do all things through Christ, or through him who gives me the strength. And people apply that to sometimes saying, well, anything is possible if you simply trust in God to give you the strength to do it. Well, let's see if that's actually what Paul is trying to say to the Philippians in this particular passage. So, 3 things very quickly tonight we'd like to observe from this passage. The first is that contentment begins not with a desire to get, but a desire to give. See, if we live our lives constantly with a desire to get, we will never be content. But true contentment begins not with a desire to get, but with a desire to give. Because as we are content with what we have, we are able to share with those who have not. As we are content with what God has blessed us with, we are able to joyfully share with one another. And so Paul writes in verse 10, he says, I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. So he says, you have a heart that is truly content. Because not only did you have a concern for me, but you desired to do something about that concern, but you had no opportunity to show it. In other words, contentment begins not with a desire to get, but with a desire to give. And Paul says in verse 11, I'm not saying this because I am in need. He says, I'm not saying that, hey, good job for you trying to look out for my needs. I'm not saying this because I am in need. I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. He says, sometimes things are good, sometimes things are bad, but it doesn't really matter what the circumstances are. I've learned to be content because I've learned that contentment begins not with a desire to get, but with a desire to give. Not to be an instrument of receiving blessings from God, but being an instrument of God's blessings to those who are around us. The second observation we make in verse 12 is contentment is not something that is attained through circumstances, but it is attained by recognizing that we all have all that we need in the Lord. True contentment is not something that is attained through the circumstances. So if we have all positive circumstances, then we are content. No, the most discontented people are those who have everything. The people who complain the most are the people who have the most. The people who are the most content are those who have learned that in whatsoever state they find themselves in, they can choose to be happy. They can choose to be content in their circumstances. So contentment is not something that is attained through circumstances. It is attained as we recognize that we have all that we need in the Lord. And so he says in verse 12, I know what it is to be in need. Paul, the greatest evangelist that ever lived, the first missionary sent out from the church in Antioch, blessed by God with the ability to perform miracles, to preach, to communicate truth, to be logical, and eventually the writer of 13, possibly even 14 books of the New Testament. That's at least half, or maybe more than half, of the books of the New Testament written by this man Paul, under the inspiration, of course, of the Holy Spirit, being guided along by the Holy Spirit. But this Paul said, I know what it is to be in need. God allowed Paul to go through difficult circumstances in spite of his faithfulness. God allowed Paul to go through difficult circumstances. But also God blessed him immeasurably at times. And he says, I know what it is to have plenty as well. Before Paul became a Christian, he lived a life of being highly respected. He was well educated. He was a leader and probably had all of his earthly needs met and then some. And yet he chose to follow Christ. And he said, as a result, I know what it is to be in need. Yes, I've experienced plenty as well. He says, here's the secret. He says, I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. He says, there's a secret to living a life of contentment, and that is to recognize that we have all that we need in the Lord. Which brings us to his third observation, and that is contentment recognizes that God gives us the strength to handle the trials, and God provides the blessings in his time. Contentment fully recognizes these two truths. Contentment fully recognizes that when we have struggles, when we have difficulties, when we have trials that come into our lives, and we will, if the greatest servant of God in the New Testament era, a man who lived by faith and worked hard to share the gospel, if he had to suffer need, what are we? How can we expect everything to always be a bed of roses? So Paul says, look, contentment recognizes that God gives us the strength to handle the trials, and we can rest in that truth. But secondly, God provides the blessings in his time. We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are the called according to his purpose. But in his time, he makes all things beautiful. And so contentment is possible as long as we don't base our sense of contentment on our circumstances, on our experiences, on our expectations. Contentment, true, lasting, heartfelt, restful, and peace-oriented contentment is possible as we recognize that God gives us the strength to handle the trials, and God provides the blessings in his time. And so he says in verse 13 in closing, here's the secret. Remember he closed the last verse 12 with, I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. He said, here's the secret. I can do all this through him who gives me the strength. It is God who in difficult times gives me the strength to be content. It is God who provides the blessings in his time. So, this is our final message in our B series on the subject of be content.
Thank you for listening. You can also join us in person or live on Facebook every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Japan time. This has been a ministry of Sakahogi International Grace Baptist Church.